The old man's hands trembled as he clutched the edge of the wooden table, his eyes distant, staring at something none of us could see. His voice, low and hoarse, carried the weight of 100 nightmares. "We thought we were prepared," he began, his words uneven, faltering, like a man trying to climb a mountain in the dark. "Prepared for battle, for the Modocs, for the lava beds. But what we faced out there, no man can prepare for that." The room fell silent, the crackling of the small fire in the corner the only sound. We leaned in closer, the shadows of the dim lantern flickering across the walls. The story he was about to tell wasn't just a war story. It was something far darker. His breath caught for a moment before he continued, his voice heavy with regret. "It started with the smoke," he said. "At first, we thought it was just another fire the Modocs had set to slow us down. But this smoke, it didn't behave like smoke. It clung to the ground, thick and heavy, rolling toward us like a living thing. The air was hot, suffocating. And then we saw it, the fire." His hands shook as he described the scene. "It wasn't like any fire I'd ever seen. It didn't burn like a wildfire. It moved, fast and deliberate, like it was hunting us. The heat wrapped around you, choking you, burning your lungs before you even got close. Men screamed, trying to run, but the flames caught them. They didn't stand a chance." I saw the glimmer of tears in his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. His gaze met mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "I watched brothers turn to ash in seconds," he whispered. "Their faces twisted in agony, their voices gone. No gun, no blade could stop it. The fire wasn't just fire, it was alive, feeding on us, feeding on our fear, on our hate." The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, the warmth of the fire suddenly oppressive. None of us dared to speak, too caught in the gravity of his words. He ran a hand through his thinning gray hair and exhaled deeply, as if trying to push the memory away. "We weren't just fighting the Modocs anymore," he said. "We were fighting something ancient, something beyond human understanding. The Modocs called it the Phoenix Firebird. They said it was a guardian, a creature born of flame and vengeance, awakened by the blood we spilled on their sacred land." His words hit like a punch to the gut, a creature of vengeance, born from the violence of war. It sounded impossible, yet the conviction in his voice made it hard to doubt. The first time I saw it," he continued, "I thought it was the end of the world. It came through the smoke, its wings spanning the sky, its body blazing like the sun. Its eyes, God, its eyes burned like they could see straight into your soul. It screamed, and the ground shook, the air cracked like thunder. Men froze where they stood, their minds breaking before the fire even touched them." He paused, his hand gripping the table so hard his knuckles turned white. "We tried to fight it," he said bitterly. "We fired every bullet we had, threw everything we could at it. But the flames just swallowed it all. It didn't even flinch. It was like trying to fight a storm." His voice dropped to a whisper. "And then it turned on us. I still see it in my nightmares. Men running, screaming, their bodies consumed by the fire. The air smelled like burning flesh, and the ground was covered in ash, the only trace of those who had been there. The room felt colder despite the fire burning nearby. No one moved, no one spoke. We were caught in his words, trapped in the horror of his memories." He leaned back in his chair, his shoulders slumping, as if the weight of the story was too much to bear. "I thought I was going to die that night," he admitted. I prayed for it, begged for it, anything to escape that hell. But something happened. The Modocs, they saved us. The men we were supposed to be fighting, they pulled us from the flames, dragged us into the caves where the fire couldn't reach. His voice cracked, and he looked away as if ashamed. We were enemies, but in that moment it didn't matter. We were just men, fighting to survive against something none of us could comprehend. He fell silent, the room heavy with the weight of his words. I wanted to ask him what happened next, how they survived, but the look in his eyes stopped me. Whatever came next, it was worse than anything he had already described. The old soldier closed his eyes, his lips trembling as he whispered, "The Firebird wasn't just hunting us. It was punishing us. And it wasn't done. The caves were our salvation, but they were also our tomb." The Modocs led us deep into the labyrinth of jagged rock and shadow, their movements quick and deliberate, as if they had done this 100 times before. We stumbled after them, coughing on the smoke that still clung to our clothes, our lungs raw from the heat. The air inside the caves was cool but stale, heavy with the scent of earth and something older, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. There were only a handful of us left now. Carter was limping, his face pale and streaked with soot. Briggs kept looking over his shoulder, gripping his rifle even though we all knew it was useless. Marks hadn't spoken since we entered the caves, his eyes wide and hollow, like he had already seen his own death. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on us, broken only by the sound of our boots scraping against the stone, and the distant, low rumble of the Firebird outside. The Modocs stopped suddenly, their leader, Captain Jack, raising a hand to signal silence. He turned to us, his face hard and unreadable, his dark eyes scanning each of us in turn. "You brought this," he said, his voice low but cutting. His English was clear, precise, his word carrying the weight of truth. "Your war awakened it. Your blood fed it." I wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't our fault, but the words caught in my throat. He was right. We had come here, rifles in hand, ready to fight and kill. The Firebird didn't care about sides. It cared about the violence we had unleashed on its land. Briggs finally spoke, his voice rough. "What is it? That thing out there? How do we stop it?" Jack's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. "You don't stop it," he said simply. "You survive it, if it lets you." The words sent a chill through me, colder than the air in the caves. Carter shook his head, his voice shaking. "That can't be it. There has to be a way. Something we can do?" Jack hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the other Modocs. They exchanged looks, their faces grim, before he finally spoke. "The Firebird is not just a creature. It is the land's memory. It remembers every drop of blood spilled, every act of hatred. It burns because you burn. To stop it, you would have to unmake your war." His words hung in the air like a death sentence. Unmake the war? How could we even begin to do that? The despair in the room was palpable, the weight of his truth settling over us like a shroud. Briggs clenched his jaw, his hand tightening on his rifle. "If there's no way to stop it, then why are we even hiding? What's the point?" Jack stepped closer, his expression fierce. "The point is to survive, to remember. If you leave this place alive, you will carry its memory, and maybe, just maybe, you will not make the same mistakes again." The silence that followed was deafening. No one wanted to admit he was right, but deep down, we all knew he was. The Firebird wasn't just punishing us, it was teaching us a lesson. A brutal, unforgiving lesson that we might not live long enough to understand. Outside the caves, the rumble of the Firebird grew louder, a low, guttural roar that vibrated through the walls. The flames hadn't reached the caves, but their light danced across the stone, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own. I could feel the heat even from here, a reminder of the destruction waiting just beyond the stone walls. Carter sat down heavily, his head in his hands. "I don't understand," he muttered. "Why us? Why now?" Jack knelt beside him, his voice quieter now but no less firm. "Because this is the land's way. It has always been this way. When men bring war to its heart, it strikes back. It doesn't matter who you are or why you fight. It only cares about the blood." The word struck something deep within me, a truth I didn't want to face. All my life, I had been told war was about honor, about fighting for something bigger than myself. But here, in this hellish place, those ideals felt hollow. The Firebird didn't care about honor or bravery. It cared about the violence we brought with us, the endless cycle of destruction we couldn't seem to escape. The ground beneath us trembled suddenly, the rumble of the Firebird's cries growing louder. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the Modocs exchanged uneasy glances. Jack stood, his face tight with tension. "It's close," he said. "We need to move." We scrambled to our feet, the fear in the room palpable. The Modocs led the way, deeper into the caves, their movements swift and practiced. We followed, stumbling over the uneven ground, our breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The walls seemed to close in around us, the darkness pressing down like a living thing. As we moved, the glow of the flames outside grew brighter, spilling into the tunnels like molten light. The air grew hotter, the rumble louder, until it felt like the Firebird was right on our heels. I could hear its cries now, sharp and piercing, a sound that seemed to cut straight to the soul. We rounded a corner, and suddenly the tunnel opened into a vast cavern. The ceiling stretched high above, disappearing into darkness, while the floor was scattered with ancient carvings and symbols etched into the stone. At the center of the cavern stood a massive stone altar, its surface glowing faintly with an eerie, otherworldly light. Jack stopped, his eyes fixed on the altar. "This is it," he said. "This is where it must be done." "What must be done?" Briggs asked, his voice tight with suspicion. "Huh?" Jack turned to face us, his expression grim. "If you want to survive, if you want to leave this place, you must prove yourselves worthy. The Firebird feeds on your violence. To stop it, you must give up what you brought here." "Jack?" managed my wife. His words sent a chill through me, colder than the flames outside. "You mean our weapons?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Jack nodded. "Your weapons, your hate, your war, all of it. Only then will the Firebird be satisfied." The cavern fell silent as we stared at the altar, the weight of Jack's words sinking in. Outside, the Firebird's cries grew louder, closer, a reminder that time was running out. The cavern was massive, its walls towering above us like the hollow ribs of some ancient beast. The air was thick with tension, a palpable weight pressing down on us as we stared at the glowing altar. The faint hum coming from the carvings on its surface seemed to echo the Firebird's distant cries, a chilling reminder that we were far from safe. Briggs stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the altar. "You're saying we toss our weapons onto that thing and the Firebird just goes away?" His voice was skeptical, his grip tightening on the rifle he knew was useless. Jack stood firm, his expression as unyielding as the stone around us. "If you want to leave this place alive, you'll do as I say. The Firebird is not a creature of flesh and blood. It is an idea, a memory of the violence you've brought here. Your weapons are the first step." Marks laughed bitterly, his voice echoing harshly in the cavern. "So we just hand over our only means of defense? Great plan. Let's see how well that works when we're running for our lives." "Your weapons can't protect you," Jack said coldly. "They only feed its power. The Firebird thrives on violence. It doesn't care who you are or why you fight. It only sees what you've done." Mark sneered but said nothing more. His knuckles were white as he gripped his rifle, his fear and anger bubbling just beneath the surface. I couldn't blame him. The thought of giving up, the last thing that gave us any semblance of control, was terrifying. But deep down, I knew Jack was right. The Firebird wasn't something we could fight, not with bullets or bayonets. Bridge turned to the rest of us, his jaw tight. "We don't have a choice," he said. "If we stay here arguing, that thing is going to find us, and we're done for." Carter nodded hesitantly, his hands trembling as he reached for the revolver strapped to his side. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "If it means getting out of here, I'll do it." Slowly, one by one, we stepped forward. Carter was the first to place his weapon on the altar, the metal clattering against the stone. The carvings glowed brighter for a moment, the hum growing louder, almost approving. I followed, my rifle feeling heavier than it ever had before as I laid it down. Marks hesitated, his face contorted with fear and frustration, but eventually he did the same. Briggs was the last. He approached the altar slowly, his gaze fixed on the glowing carvings. His rifle hung at his side, the strap worn and frayed from years of use. He paused, his fingers brushing the wood grain of the stock, before finally placing it on the altar. The hum reached a crescendo, the light flaring bright enough to make us shield our eyes. When it faded, the weapons were gone. The altar stood bare, its surface smooth and unmarred, as if it had absorbed them completely. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of our breathing. "Now what?" Marks asked, his voice shaking. "Is it over?" Jack shook his head, his expression grim. "This is only the beginning. The Firebird may sleep for a moment, but its hunger is not yet sated. You've given up your weapons, but the balance is still broken." "Balance?" Briggs asked, his voice edged with frustration. "What balance?" Jack turned to him, his dark eyes burning with intensity. "The land has memory. Every step you take, every drop of blood spilled, it remembers. You've disturbed it. The Firebird is a warning, a way to remind us of what we've done, but it won't rest until it is satisfied." Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath us trembled. The faint hum of the altar gave way to a deep, resonant rumble that echoed through the cavern. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the glow of the carvings flickered like a dying flame. "It's coming," Jack said sharply. "We need to move." We didn't need to be told twice. The Modocs led the way, their movements swift and practiced, while we stumbled after them, our footsteps echoing loudly in the confined space. The heat returned, pressing against us like a living thing, and the distant cries of the Firebird grew louder, sharper, more desperate. The tunnels twisted and turned, the jagged walls closing in around us. The air was suffocating, every breath a struggle, and the glow of the flames outside began to creep into the darkness, chasing us deeper into the labyrinth. My heart pounded in my chest, the fear clawing at my throat as I ran. We reached a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a single person. and scrambled through one by one. I could feel the heat at my back, the Firebird's presence looming closer with every step. The rumble of its cries shook the ground, the sound piercing and otherworldly, like a chorus of screams layered upon each other. When we emerged on the other side, the cavern opened into a wide, flat expanse. The floor was littered with broken stones and ancient carvings, the remnants of a long forgotten civilization. At the center stood another altar, larger and more imposing than the first. Its surface was cracked and weathered, but the carvings glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat, visibly radiating the shadow labyrinth, pulsing like a heartbeat. "This is it," Jack said, his voice tight. "This is where it ends." Briggs stepped forward, his eyes scanning the cavern. "What do we do?" Jack hesitated, his gaze flickering to the altar. "The Firebird won't stop until it has what it wants." "And what does it want?" Carter asked, his voice trembling. Jack's eyes met ours, his expression solemn. "It wants a life." The words hit like a thunderclap, the weight of them sinking into my chest. The silence that followed was suffocating, each of us grappling with the meaning of his words. A life. A sacrifice. One of us would have to stay behind. The Firebird's cry echoed through the cavern, louder and closer than ever. The flames were coming and time was running out. The Firebird's cries reverberated through the cavern, a sound so raw and furious it made my teeth ache. The flames began to creep into the edges of the cavern, their light casting wild, flickering shadows against the walls. The heat was oppressive, wrapping around us like a living thing, and with every passing second, it grew closer. The altar stood in the center of the room, its faint glow pulsing in time with the Firebird's roars, as if calling to it. Jack turned to us, his face a mask of urgency and sorrow. "The land demands balance," he said. "One of us must stay. It's the only way." Marks threw his hands up in frustration, his voice rising in panic. "Stay? Are you out of your mind? You're asking us to just throw someone to that thing?" Jack's expression didn't waver. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you the truth. The Firebird won't stop until the balance is restored. It doesn't care who stays. It only cares that someone does." Carter's breathing quickened, his eyes darting between the altar and the advancing flames. "There has to be another way," he said, his voice trembling. "Something we missed. Maybe if we—" "There is no other way," Jack snapped, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This is not a battle you can win with reason or force. The land doesn't negotiate. It only remembers." The weight of his words pressed down on us like a stone. The truth was undeniable, yet impossible to accept. We had come here as soldiers, prepared to face death on a battlefield, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't a fight for victory or survival. This was a judgment. Briggs stepped forward, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the room. "If someone has to stay," he said quietly, "then we need to decide now. The longer we wait, the worse it's going to get." Marks turned on him, his face red with anger and fear. "Oh, so you're just fine with sacrificing one of us? Maybe it should be you then." Briggs didn't flinch. "Maybe it should," he said evenly, his gaze steady. "But screaming at each other isn't going to solve anything. We need to think." Think. The word felt laughable in the face of what we were experiencing. How could we think when the air itself felt like it was burning, when the ground beneath us trembled with the Firebird's approach? My mind raced, searching for some other solution, some way out that didn't involve condemning one of us to death. But there was nothing, no answers, just the altar and the unrelenting heat. The Modocs stood silently to the side, their faces solemn. They had seen this before, I realized. They knew what was coming, and they had already accepted it. I envied their resolve, their ability to stand firm in the face of something so incomprehensible. But I also hated them for it, for knowing the truth and saying nothing until it was too late. The flames crept closer, licking at the edges of the cavern, their light illuminating the carvings on the altar. The symbols seemed to shift and twist, their meanings just out of reach. The air was thick with smoke, and every breath felt like swallowing ash. The Firebird's cries grew louder, a deafening cacophony that made my head pound. Briggs stepped toward the altar, his movements deliberate. "We don't have time for this," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If we don't make a decision, it's going to make one for us." Carter reached out, grabbing his arm. "Briggs, no, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," Briggs said, cutting him off. He pulled his arm free, his gaze locked on the altar. "I don't want to die, Carter. None of us do. But if staying here means the rest of you can leave, then that's what I'm going to do." "No!" Mox shouted, stepping forward. "You don't get to play the hero. If anyone's staying, it's not going to be you." Briggs turned to him, his expression unreadable. "And what would you do, Marks? Hide? Run? This isn't about being a hero. This is about doing what has to be done." The two men stared each other down, the tension in the room so thick it was almost suffocating. I wanted to step in, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. My legs felt rooted to the ground, my chest tight with fear and guilt. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. We were supposed to fight together, to survive together, but the Firebird didn't care about our plans. The ground shook violently, and a section of the cavern wall crumbled, sending a shower of rocks tumbling to the floor. The flames surged forward, their heat searing, and the Firebird's silhouette appeared in the haze, its glowing eyes locking onto us. It let out a cry that shook the very air, a sound so loud and piercing it felt like my skull was splitting. Briggs turned back to the altar, his face set with determination. "Get out of here," he said over his shoulder. "All of you." "Briggs, no!" Carter shouted. But it was too late. Briggs stepped up to the altar, his hand reaching out to touch the glowing surface. The symbols flared to life, their light blinding, and the hum that had been a faint background noise became a deafening roar. The Firebird screeched, its massive form surging forward, but it stopped just short of the altar, its flames recoiling as if burned by the light. The cavern shook violently, the ground splitting beneath our feet. "Go!" Briggs shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Now!" Jack grabbed Carter and pulled him toward the tunnel, the Modocs leading the way. Marks hesitated, his face pale and his body trembling. But he turned and followed, his curses lost in the noise. I was the last to move, my feet dragging as I looked back at Briggs one final time. He stood at the altar, his hand pressed against its surface, his body illuminated by the swirling light. The Firebird roared, its flames thrashing against the cavern walls, but it couldn't touch him. The light grew brighter, blinding, and then everything went silent. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring, as if the world itself had been muted. I stumbled through the tunnel. The light from the altar still burned into my vision, casting ghostly shapes on the edges of my mind. The heat was gone, replaced by an eerie, almost unnatural chill. The Firebird's roar, the crackling flames, the hum of the altar, it had all vanished, leaving only the sound of our labored breaths and the faint scuff of boots against stone. We emerged into a smaller cavern, the Modocs guiding us with sure steps. Carter leaned heavily against the wall, his face pale and streaked with soot. Marks paced back and forth, muttering to himself, his hands shaking violently. I slumped against the nearest rock, my legs barely able to hold me up. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in, and it was like a weight pressing on my chest. "He's gone," Carter said finally, his voice trembling. "Briggs is gone." Jack turned to him, his expression unreadable. "He made his choice," he said quietly, "and because of that, you're alive." Marks exploded, his voice raw with anger and grief. "Alive? You call this alive? We just left him there to die. For what? For some monster that shouldn't even exist?" Jack didn't flinch, his gaze steady and cold. "He saved you. That's all that matters now. The land demanded a sacrifice and he gave it willingly. If you want to honor him, then survive. Carry his memory. Learn from this." Marks let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Learn? Learn what? That we're pawns in some cosmic game? That this place is cursed? What are we supposed to do with that? No one answered him. The Modocs exchanged quiet looks, their faces lined with a grief I didn't fully understand. This wasn't the first time they had seen the Firebird's wrath, and I suspected it wouldn't be the last. They carried the weight of it, the knowledge of what this land demanded, and they bore it with a quiet strength that made me feel small. Jack motioned for us to follow him. "We need to keep moving," he said. "The Firebird may be gone for now, but the land is still watching. It always watches." The path ahead was narrow and winding, the air cold and damp. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the cavern ceiling. My mind was racing, replaying the events over and over. Briggs's face, his voice, the way he stood at the altar with such calm determination, it was all burned into my memory. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had left more than just him behind in that cavern. We had left a part of ourselves. After what felt like hours, we emerged into the open air. The night sky stretched above us, the stars sharp and bright against the inky blackness. The flames that had consumed the lava beds were gone, leaving behind a landscape of ash and smoldering stone. The air was still, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Carter sank to his knees, his head in his hands. "It's over," he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's finally over." But it didn't feel over. The Firebird's absence was almost more unsettling than its presence, like the calm after a storm that you know isn't finished. The land felt alive, watching, waiting. I could feel its weight pressing down on me, a silent judgment that I couldn't escape. Jack stood a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "This place will never be the same," he said. "You've seen it now, the truth of what this land holds. Remember it. Carry it with you." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but the words wouldn't come. There was something final in his tone, a sense of resignation that chilled me to the bone. The Modocs began to move, their steps silent and deliberate, and we followed, too exhausted and broken to question them. We walked for hours, the landscape shifting from ash and stone to sparse vegetation and rolling hills. The stars gave way to the first light of dawn, casting the land in shades of gray and gold. The silence persisted, heavy and unbroken, until Jack finally stopped and turned to us. "This is where we part ways," he said. "You have your lives. Use them wisely." Marks stepped forward, his face twisted with anger and desperation. "That's it? You're just going to leave us after everything we've been through?" Jack's expression softened, but only slightly. "There's nothing more I can do for you. The Firebird is gone, but the land remembers. It will always remember. If you want to honor Briggs, then leave this place and never come back." Marks opened his mouth to argue, but Carter placed a hand on his shoulder, shaking his head. "Let it go," he said quietly. "He's right." Jack nodded once, then turned and walked away, the other Modocs following without a word. We watched them disappear into the distance, their figures fading into the morning light. And then it was just us. 3 soldiers standing in the middle of a land that felt more like a graveyard than anything else. Carter broke the silence, his voice barely audible. "What do we do now?" I looked at him, at Marks, at the barren land around us. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the Firebird was gone, but its presence lingered, a shadow that would follow us for the rest of our lives. I thought of Briggs, of his sacrifice, and I felt a pang of guilt so deep it was almost unbearable. Finally, I felt a pang of guilt at my sorrow. "We go home," I said finally, though the word felt hollow. "And we remember." Carter nodded slowly, and Marks let out a shaky breath. We began to walk, our steps heavy, the weight of what we had seen pressing down on us with every mile. The land was silent, but I could feel it watching, its memory etched into every rock and blade of grass. As we moved further from the lava beds, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest echo of the Firebird's cry. I stopped for a moment, turning to look back at the horizon, half expecting to see its fiery wings rising from the ash. But there was nothing. Just the empty sky and the endless, unforgiving land. I turned back and kept walking, the sound of that cry lingering in my mind, a haunting reminder of the cost of war. The journey away from the lava beds was silent and slow. None of us spoke, each man consumed by his own thoughts, his own guilt. The land stretched out before us, barren and scorched, a bleak reminder of what we had unleashed. Every step felt heavier, like the weight of Briggs' sacrifice was pressing down on us, refusing to let us forget. Marks was the first to break the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you think he knew this would happen? That he'd have to stay?" Carter didn't answer right away. He kept his gaze on the ground, his shoulders slumped. Finally he said, "Briggs wasn't the kind of man to back down from what needed to be done. He didn't know, but maybe he felt it, like it was meant to be." The words hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The memory of Briggs standing at the altar, his face calm and resolute, played over and over in my mind. He had made his choice, but that didn't make it easier to accept. As the sun climbed higher, the heat returned, though it was nothing compared to the inferno we had left behind. The dry air stung my throat, and my legs felt like lead. But it wasn't just exhaustion. It was the feeling that the land itself was resisting us, pushing back with every step we took. I could still feel its presence, the same oppressive weight that had filled the caves. The Firebird might have been gone, but the land wasn't finished with us. We stopped to rest near a cluster of jagged rocks, the only shade we could find. Carter slumped against the largest one, his head tilted back, his eyes closed. Marks paced restlessly, his boots kicking up dust with each step. I sat a little apart from them, staring out at the horizon, where the blackened earth gave way to dry grass and scrub. "Thing," Mark said suddenly, his voice sharper than before. "The Firebird. It wasn't just some guardian, was it? It was more than that. It felt, I don't know, alive." Carter opened his eyes and looked at him. Of course it was alive. Didn't you see the way it moved, the way it looked at us? That wasn't just some wild beast. It knew what it was doing. Marks shook his head, his pacing growing more frantic. "No, I mean, it was like it knew us, like it saw everything we'd done, everything we were. It wasn't just attacking us, it was judging us." I stayed quiet, but I couldn't deny the truth in his words. The Firebird hadn't just been a creature of fire and vengeance, it had been something far older, far more knowing. Its eyes, those molten embers that seemed to burn into your very soul, had seen more than just the present. They had seen the past, the blood we'd spilled, the lives we'd taken, and they had condemned us for it? Mark stopped pacing and turned to us, his face pale and drawn. Do you think it's really gone, or is it just waiting, watching?" Carter didn't answer. Neither did I. What could we say? The Firebird was part of the land, and the land never truly forgets. It might be silent now, but that didn't mean it was gone. The thought sent a chill through me, despite the heat. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, we started walking again. The landscape slowly shifted, the scorched earth giving way to sparse vegetation and rolling hills. The sight should have been a relief, a sign that we were leaving the worst behind, but it wasn't. The further we got from the lava beds, the more the silence seemed to press in, like the land itself was holding its breath. We came across an old Modoc trail, the ground marked by faint tracks and scattered stones. Jack's voice echoed in my mind, "The land remembers." I glanced back at the others, and I could see the same thought reflected in their eyes. The trail felt different, heavier, as if it carried the weight of countless stories, countless sacrifices. Carter spoke up as we walked, his voice quieter than usual. "You think anyone's going to believe us about what happened out there?" Mark snorted bitterly. "Of course not. They'll call us crazy, say we were hallucinating from the heat or the smoke, and maybe they'll be right. Maybe that's all it was." "You don't believe that?" Carter said, glancing at him. Marks didn't respond, but the look on his face said everything. None of us believed it had been a hallucination. The Firebird had been real, its flames, its fury, its judgment, all of it. But explaining that to anyone else? Impossible. We walked in silence after that, the light fading into the soft hues of twilight. The horizon glowed faintly, the remnants of the day's heat shimmering in the distance. I felt a strange sense of unease, as if we were being watched. Though I knew the Firebird was gone, still the feeling wouldn't leave me. When we finally stopped for the night, the stars had begun to appear, scattered across the darkening sky. Carter built a small fire, more for comfort than warmth, while Mark sat with his back to a rock, staring into the flames. I sat a little apart, the weight of everything we'd seen and done pressing down on me like a physical force. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the quiet night. I glanced at the horizon, half expecting to see the glow of flames, the silhouette of wings, but there was nothing. Just the endless expanse of land and sky. Carter spoke after a long silence, his voice barely audible. Do you think he's at peace now?" Carter's breathless words tumbled over each other. Maddox slowly turned. I didn't know how to answer. Part of me wanted to say yes, to believe that his sacrifice had freed him, that he had found some kind of solace, but another part of me, the part that still felt the weight of the land's judgment, knew the truth. Briggs wasn't free. He was part of it now, just like the Firebird, just like the stories Jack had told us. He's part of the balance, I said finally. That's all we can hope for. Carter nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the fire. Marks didn't say anything, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped his knees. None of us would ever be the same. The Firebird was gone, but its presence lingered, etched into our memories, our souls. As I lay down to sleep, the faintest sound reached my ears, carried on the wind. It was almost too quiet to hear, but it sent a chill through me all the same. A cry, distant, echoing, and unmistakable. The night was restless. The distant cry we'd heard echoed in my mind, faint, yet unshakable. It wasn't the deafening roar of the Firebird we had faced in the lava beds. It was something softer, almost mournful. Still, it carried the same weight. The land was not done with us. I lay awake, staring at the stars, their faint light doing little to comfort me. Every rustle of the wind, every crackle of the fire sent my pulse racing. Carter and Marks were quiet, but I knew they weren't sleeping either. The Firebird's shadow loomed over all of us, even in its absence. At some point, Carter sat up, his face gaunt and weary in the firelight. "Do you feel it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded. There was no need to ask what he meant. The air felt heavy, as though the land itself was breathing, its presence all around us. It wasn't just the memory of the Firebird. It was something deeper, older, and far more patient. Mark stirred, sitting up with a groan. "We should keep moving," he said, his voice hoarse. "I don't like staying in one place too long. Feels like we're being watched." Carter glanced at him, then back at me. "Do you think it's still out there?" he asked hesitantly. "The Firebird?" I didn't want to answer. The truth was, I didn't know. We had seen it vanish, consumed by the light of the altar and Briggs' sacrifice. But the land still felt alive, its memory etched into every rock and blade of grass. The Firebird wasn't just a creature, it was a force, a manifestation of everything we had brought to this place, and forces like that didn't simply disappear. "I think it's resting," I said finally, "waiting for the next spark." Mark scoffed, shaking his head. "That's comforting, real comforting." We broke camp at first light, our movements slow and weary. The trail ahead was rough, the ground uneven and littered with stones. The horizon stretched out before us, barren and endless, and every step felt like a struggle. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of our boots and the occasional gust of wind. As we walked, I found myself replaying the events of the past few days in my mind. The flames, the cries, the haunting eyes of the Firebird. But more than that, I thought of Briggs, the way he had stood at the altar, unflinching, his resolve unshaken. He had been a good man, a brave man, and he was gone because of us, because of the war we had brought to this place. Carter broke the silence as we crested a small hill. "Do you think anyone will ever know the truth?" he asked, his voice distant. "About what happened here?" Mark snorted. "You mean the part where we fought a giant flaming bird and one of us sacrificed himself to stop it? Yeah, I'm sure they'll believe every word." Carter frowned but didn't argue. I understood his frustration. The truth was too incredible, too impossible. No one would believe it, not unless they had seen it for themselves. And maybe that was for the best. Some truths were too heavy to share. We stopped at midday to rest, the sun high overhead, its heat bearing down on us. The landscape had begun to change, the scorched earth giving way to patches of grass and sparse trees. It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. The land still felt alive, its presence an unshakable weight. Mark sat with his back to a tree, his rifle long gone, but his hand still resting on his knees as if ready to grab it. "This place isn't right," he muttered. "Even now it feels wrong, like it's watching us." Carter nodded. "Jack said the land remembers. Maybe it's waiting to see if we've learned anything." Marks let out a bitter laugh. "Learned what? That we're all just pawns in some ancient game? That no matter what we do, it's never enough? Maybe it's not about being enough," I said quietly. "Maybe it's about understanding, about carrying the weight of what we've done and trying to be better." Marks looked at me, his eyes tired and skeptical. "And do you really believe that? That we can change?" I didn't answer. I didn't know if I believed it. But I had to try. Briggs's sacrifice had to mean something. It couldn't just be another tragedy, another name lost to the ashes of war. The day wore on, the sun dipping lower in the sky as we continued our journey. The landscape became greener, the air cooler, but the weight in my chest didn't lift. Every step felt heavier, like the land itself was trying to pull me back. The Firebird was gone, but its memory remained, a shadow that would follow us forever. By the time we made camp for the night, the stars were beginning to appear, their light soft and distant. Carter built another fire, the flames small and flickering, while Marks sat a little apart, staring out into the darkness. I lay on my back, staring up at the sky, my thoughts a tangled mess of guilt and regret. As the fire crackled softly, Carter spoke, his voice low. "Do you think Briggs? Do you think he's part of it now? The land, I mean?" I thought about the altar, the way it had glowed with an otherworldly light, the way Briggs had stood there, unflinching, as the Firebird roared around him. I thought about Jack's words, "The land remembers." "I think he's part of the balance," I said finally. "Whatever that means." Carter nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. Marks didn't say anything, but I could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands clenched and unclenched. None of us would ever forget what we had seen, what we had done. The Firebird had burned itself into our memories, just as it had burned the land. The night passed slowly, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind. I lay awake, my mind racing, and every so often I thought I heard it. The faintest echo of a cry, distant and mournful, carried on the breeze. When morning came, we packed up and continued walking, the horizon stretching out before us. The land was quiet, but I could feel its presence, heavy and unyielding. It wasn't done with us. Not yet. The final stretch of the journey back felt endless. The land around us began to show signs of life, patches of green grass, clusters of wildflowers, even a trickling stream. It should have been a relief, but the unease in my chest only grew stronger. Each step away from the lava beds felt like a betrayal, as though we were abandoning something we had yet to understand. Carter walked silently beside me, his face drawn and pale. Marks lagged a few steps behind, his head low, his boots dragging through the dirt. None of us spoke, the weight of the past days settling over us like a shroud. The Firebird's cries still echoed faintly in my mind, a haunting reminder of what we had left behind. By the time we reached the outskirts of the nearest settlement, the sun was setting, casting the world in hues of orange and gold. The sight of buildings, of people going about their lives, felt surreal. It was as if we had stepped into another world, one untouched by the horrors we had faced, but the scars we carried, both seen and unseen, would not let us forget. A man approached us, his face lined with worry. He wore a faded Union uniform, and his eyes scanned us quickly, taking in our soot-streaked faces and tattered clothes. "Soldiers?" he asked, his voice cautious. "You boys coming from the lava beds?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. Carter stepped forward, nodding slowly. "We were part of the operation," he said quietly. "What's left of it." The man's face darkened. "Heard it was bad up there, real bad. They said the Modocs were fierce, but there's been talk. Strange talk. Fires that don't burn out, men disappearing. You see any of that?" Marks let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "You wouldn't believe us if we told you," which, as Bruce learned last week, was a lot. The man frowned, his gaze flicking between us. "Try me." Carter looked at me, then back at the man. "There was fire," he said, his voice low. "But it wasn't just fire. It was something else. Something alive." The man's expression tightened, but he didn't press further. "You look like you've been through hell," he said finally. "There's a doctor in town. Might be able to patch you up." We thanked him and moved on, his curious gaze following us until we disappeared into the narrow streets. The settlement was small, just a handful of buildings and a dusty main road. But to us, it felt like stepping into another universe. People stared as we passed, their eyes filled with curiosity and something close to pity. I couldn't blame them. We must have looked like ghosts. We found the doctor's office near the edge of town, a small weathered building with a faded sign hanging above the door. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of herbs. The doctor, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a quick hand, examined us without asking too many questions. He stitched up Mark's cuts, cleaned the burns on Carter's arms, and handed me a vial of something that tasted bitter but dulled the ache in my chest. As he worked, he glanced at us with quiet curiosity. "You boys seen some things out there, haven't you?" he asked. "More than we wanted to," I said, my voice heavy. He nodded, as if he understood, though I doubted he truly could. "War leaves its marks," he said. "Some you see, some you don't, but they're always there." We left the office feeling a little lighter, though the weight of our memories still clung to us. Carter suggested we find a place to rest for the night, and we managed to secure a small room at the local inn. The beds were hard, the walls thin, but it was the first time in days we felt even a semblance of safety. That night, as I lay staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly left the lava beds. The Firebird might have been gone, but its presence lingered, etched into the edges of my mind. I thought of Briggs, his calm expression as he stood at the altar, his final words echoing faintly in my memory. Go, live. Sleep came fitfully, my dreams a tangled mess of fire and ash, of wings that spanned the sky and eyes that burned like molten gold. I woke several times, the faint cries of the Firebird ringing in my ears, though I knew they weren't real. When morning came, the sunlight streaming through the window felt like a lie. The world outside was too bright, too untouched, as if it had forgotten the horrors we had faced. But we hadn't forgotten. We couldn't. As we prepared to leave the settlement, Carter turned to me, his face solemn. "What do we do now?" he asked. I thought about Briggs. about the Firebird, about the land that would never truly let us go. "We keep moving," I said. "We carry this with us, and we remember." Mark scoffed, his voice bitter. "Remember? What good is remembering when no one will believe us?" "It's not about them," I said quietly. "It's about us, about making sure we don't forget what happened, what we lost." Carter nodded slowly, and even Mark seemed to relent, his shoulders slumping as he let out a heavy sigh. We left the settlement as the sun climbed higher, its light casting long shadows across the land. The horizon stretched out before us, endless and uncertain. But we walked on, each step carrying the weight of what we had seen. As the settlement faded into the distance, I turned back one last time, my gaze lingering on the hills that marked the edge of the lava beds. The land was quiet, the sky clear, but I knew the truth. The Firebird was gone, but its memory remained, woven into the fabric of the earth. It was watching, waiting, and one day it would rise again. And when it did, I could only hope the world would be ready.